I don't shake hands with staff.
The conference room at Hamilton Enterprises was wrapped in cold silence when billionaire industrialist Richard Hamilton leaned back in his leather chair, raised an eyebrow, and declared loudly, "I don't shake hands with staff." The sentence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Every executive in the room shifted slightly, some hiding smirks, others trying to suppress laughter. The target of this humiliation was Michael Johnson, a sharply dressed black consultant who had just extended his hand politely in greeting. Michael froze for a second, his hand still outstretched, the weight of the insult pressing down on the moment. Slowly he withdrew his hand, lowering it calmly without a trace of visible anger. His eyes, however, carried a depth that told a different story. This moment would not be forgotten. At the far end of the room, Richard's executive team exchanged knowing glances. They were used to this. Their CEO was infamous for his arrogance, for drawing lines between what he considered real power and mere employees. But today, they underestimated the quiet man sitting across the table. Richard's booming voice filled the space again. "Let's not waste time. People like me run billion-dollar empires. People like him," he gestured dismissively toward Michael, "take notes and follow instructions." The insult was sharp, deliberate, and public. Michael adjusted his watch discreetly. A small, calculated gesture that seemed insignificant to the others, but it was his signal to himself. He had faced prejudice before, but this time, the game was different. 3 hours earlier, Michael had walked into the glass towers of Hamilton Enterprises wearing a modest navy suit, driving an unremarkable sedan and carrying himself with deliberate simplicity. No one in that building, from the receptionist who ignored him to the security guard who eyed him with suspicion, could imagine the reality. Michael Johnson was not a consultant at all. He was the CEO of a global fund controlling more than $70 billion in assets. For the executives snickering in that boardroom, he was just another outsider. For Richard Hamilton, he was nothing more than staff. What none of them realized was that every word, every glance of disdain, and every insult was being carefully recorded, not just on the small device hidden in Michael's pocket, but in the balance sheets of destiny. The billionaire thought he had just dismissed a nobody. In truth, he had just triggered the collapse of his empire. The boardroom lights glared against polished mahogany, but the tension in the air was sharper than the shine on the billionaire's shoes. Richard Hamilton sat at the head of the table, like a king on his throne, while his loyal executives leaned back smugly, feeding off his arrogance. "Mr. Johnson," Richard sneered, emphasizing the Mr. as if it were an insult, "our investors tell me you're some sort of consultant. I hope this won't take long. I have real deals to attend to." The words sliced the atmosphere. Michael said nothing. His calm, unreadable expression frustrated Richard, who thrived on watching others shrink under his disdain. Instead, Michael folded his hands neatly on the table, listening as the CEO flipped through documents without interest. Across the table, Andrew Collins, the CFO, chuckled. "You'll have to excuse Mr. Hamilton. We don't usually bring outsiders into these meetings. But if you have a checklist or whatever it is consultants carry, let's go through it quickly." A ripple of laughter followed, each executive eager to prove loyalty to their billionaire leader. Michael nodded slowly. "I'm here to understand your company's culture, your values." "Values?" Richard barked, laughing loudly. "Our only value is profit. That's why we're here at the top while staff like you watch from the sidelines." Every word was a test. Every smirk was a deliberate humiliation. What Richard and his team didn't know was that Michael had faced this theater before. As a young black analyst on Wall Street ignored in meetings, as a partner candidate denied because of cultural fit, as a strategist dismissed before, he could even present his ideas. Each scar had sharpened him, teaching him to fight with precision, not with fury. While Richard boasted about quarterly numbers, Michael's sharp eyes scanned the glossy charts. The graphs didn't align. There was a $250 million discrepancy between what Hamilton Enterprises reported publicly and what was shown here. He made no comment. "Not yet." "Tell us, Mr. Consultant," sneered Andrew Collins. "What do you People think success looks like. Michael smiled faintly. That depends on whether success is measured in numbers or in principles. The room erupted in chuckles. Richard leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. Principles? Young man, principles don't build empires. Power does, money does, and I assure you people like me have both. People like you, he jabbed his finger toward Michael, should be grateful to sit in this room. The silence that followed was suffocating. To the executives, it was another humiliation scored. To Michael, it was data. Every sneer, every arrogant remark, every unethical word catalogued meticulously, because when the tables turned, and they would, every insult would become a weapon sharper than any sword. Michael sat silently, in that hostile boardroom, but his mind wandered for a moment to the journey that had brought him here. To Richard Hamilton, he looked like an ordinary consultant, modest suit, no luxury watch, no flashy car. But behind that quiet exterior was a lifetime of battles that had forged him into steel. At just 19, Michael had worked as an unpaid intern at a small brokerage in Chicago. Every morning he arrived before sunrise, carrying stacks of reports, only to be ignored by senior bankers who called him the coffee boy. His suggestions were brushed aside without being read, until weeks later when those same ideas mysteriously reappeared on executive memos with someone else's name. At 25, he tried to pitch his first independent investment proposal. He walked into offices with flawless numbers and bulletproof research, but the rejections came before he could even present. "We don't think you'd fit our client culture," one firm told him. "Our board prefers experience from a different background," another hinted. The words were polite masks for an uglier truth, but where others might have broken, Michael sharpened himself. He studied longer than anyone, 18 hours a day. He memorized annual reports like poetry, dissected markets with surgical precision, and learned to read financial data as if it were music. He developed an instinct so sharp it seemed supernatural, the ability to predict patterns, to spot fraud where others saw growth, to smell risk in the numbers before disaster struck. Every insult became fuel, every rejection became motivation. When one door closed, he built a building of his own. By his mid-30s, Michael had quietly assembled a team of brilliant analysts, Harvard, Wharton, MIT graduates, who had all faced some form of discrimination in the corporate world. Like him, they had been told they weren't a good fit. Like him, they had learned to turn rejection into resolve. Together, they built Johnson Capital, a global investment fund managing more than $70 billion across industries. But Richard Hamilton and his board didn't know any of this. To them, he was just a consultant, a nobody they could dismiss with arrogance. As Michael adjusted his watch, a small habit he carried from his earliest days as a nervous intern, his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. A single message, from his right-hand man, Phase 1 complete. Ready for your signal. The signal that would turn years of humiliation into a moment of reckoning. Richard Hamilton leaned back in his chair, grinning at his executives as though the meeting were a comedy show performed solely for his amusement. "Our numbers speak louder than words," Richard declared, pointing his gold-plated pen at the charts on the wall. "Hamilton Enterprises is stronger than ever. We don't need lectures about values or ethics. What we need is capital. And if our investors have sent you, then let's get this over with." Michael's calm eyes swept over the glossy pages, spread across the table. The graphs looked impressive at first glance, but the deeper he glanced, the cracks widened. Figures that should have aligned didn't. Revenue growth clashed with reported energy consumption. A neat little line item had been reclassified, in a way that could fool outsiders, but not him. "Excuse me," Michael said softly, his voice measured, "but these revenue numbers don't match your public filings. There's a discrepancy of roughly $250 million. The room froze. For the first time since the meeting began, Richard stopped mid-smirk. Andrew Collins, the CFO, leaned forward, his tone sharp. "And what makes you think you're qualified to question our numbers?" Michael tilted his head slightly. "Experience." The executives exchanged irritated glances. Richard laughed dismissively, his arrogance snapping back like a reflex. "Experience? Mr. Johnson, I've been building companies since before you. Could afford your first suit. Don't presume you understand high-level corporate strategy. But his laughter sounded thinner now, less certain. Michael adjusted his watch again, the same gesture he'd made 3 times that morning, and looked directly at Richard. High-level strategy. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Would that include funneling operating costs into research investments, or disguising losses from the Meridian project as deferred assets? Andrew Collins's face drained of color. Those documents aren't public, he stammered. Richard's jaw tightened. Who exactly are you? For the first time in the meeting, Michael allowed a faint smile to form. Just someone who pays attention to details. Silence pressed heavily on the room. Executives who had moments ago chuckled now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard tried to recover, waving his hand dismissively. Irrelevant. You're just a consultant. You don't understand how real empires are run. But at that exact moment, Michael's phone vibrated again. He glanced at it discreetly. Phase 2 authorized, ready to release. He slid the phone back into his pocket without a word, his serene expression never breaking, because the truth was, Richard Hamilton had just lost control of the room, and he didn't even know it yet. The tension inside the Hamilton Enterprises boardroom thickened with every passing second. Richard Hamilton forced a laugh, but there was a tremor in his voice now. He leaned forward, glaring at Michael, as if sheer dominance could erase the unease creeping into the room. You're bluffing, Richard spat. You have no idea how this company operates. You're out of your depth. Michael remained perfectly still, his hands folded calmly in front of him. Am I? He asked softly. As if on cue, Richard's phone buzzed violently on the table. Then Andrew Collins's phone rang. Moments later, 2 other executives' devices lit up with urgent notifications. The men exchanged nervous glances, fumbling to read the alerts. Richard finally picked up his phone, his eyes scanning the screen. His smirk disappeared instantly. The headlines were brutal, and they were everywhere. Hamilton Enterprises under scrutiny. Allegations of discrimination and fraud surface. SEC to probe irregularities in Hamilton's Meridian project. Billionaire Richard Hamilton caught on recording mocking staff. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he slammed the phone face down on the table. What is this? He demanded, his voice cracking. Michael leaned back in his chair, his tone unchanged. It's accountability. Across the city, Michael's team had executed Phase 2, a precisely timed release of a 42-minute audio file capturing every arrogant word, every racist undertone, every sneer Richard and his executives had hurled during the meeting. Within minutes, journalists, investors, and advocacy groups had the file in their inboxes. The impact was instant. The recordings flooded newsrooms, trended on social media, and circulated across investor networks. Every word Richard had spoken, "I don't shake hands with staff. Our only value is profit. People like you should be grateful," echoed on TV broadcasts and online feeds. Executives in the room frantically typed messages, desperate to contain the fallout. But it was too late, Mr. Hamilton, Michael said, finally rising from his chair. In New York State, only one party needs to consent to a recording. I consented. Every insult you delivered here, every lie about your numbers, every demonstration of arrogance has been documented. The world now knows exactly who you are. Richard's face went pale. You can't do this. Michael adjusted his watch one final time and looked directly into the billionaire's panicked eyes. I already have. At that moment, Richard's desk phone blared to life. It was the chairman of the board. His furious voice echoed through the speaker. Richard, we just lost the $3.5 billion investment package. Investors are pulling out. They cited ethical concerns. Explain this, now. The boardroom went dead silent. Richard Hamilton had spent decades building his empire with arrogance and intimidation. In less than 5 minutes, it began to collapse, triggered by the man he had mocked as just staff. The boardroom that once echoed with arrogance now sat in suffocating silence. Richard Hamilton, the billionaire who had mocked a man for extending a hand, slumped in his chair. His executives, who had once smirked at every insult, now avoided eye contact. The world outside that room was shifting, and not in their favor. Michael stood calmly as if the storm unraveling around them was nothing more than a predictable outcome. His voice carried no anger, only clarity. "Mr. Hamilton, today wasn't about humiliating you, it was about holding a mirror to your company's culture." Richard sneered weakly. "You destroyed me. For what? For a handshake?" Michael shook his head gently. Not for a handshake, for what it represented. He stepped toward the window overlooking Manhattan, the skyscrapers glowing against the afternoon sun. "You see, when a leader refuses to shake hands with someone he perceives as beneath him, it reveals more than arrogance, it reveals a system. A system that tells talented people they don't belong. A system that decides worth based on skin color, social status, or last name instead of competence, dedication, or integrity." Richard shifted uncomfortably. The words cut deeper than any headline. Michael continued, his tone steady. "I've lived through that system. I've been the intern nobody noticed. I've been the analyst whose ideas were stolen. I've been the entrepreneur denied opportunities because of my background. Every rejection taught me one thing: that power without values is nothing but rot waiting to collapse." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, the man they had dismissed as staff was commanding the room, not with money, not with intimidation, but with undeniable truth. Michael turned back toward Richard. "You thought profit was your only value, but here's the reality. Companies that operate without ethics eventually pay the highest price. Arrogance blinds leaders. Discrimination poisons organizations. And sooner or later, the market, the same market you thought you controlled, demands justice." At that moment, Richard's phone buzzed again. His trembling hands picked it up. The voice of his attorney came through, sharp and urgent. "Richard, the SEC just opened a formal investigation. The media has recordings of you mocking your staff. Investors are in panic. Our stock has dropped 17% in the last hour." Richard's face went white. He pressed the phone to his chest, unable to respond. Michael spoke once more, his words deliberate. "The $3.5 billion support you thought you had, that was mine to give, or to take away. You failed not because of numbers, but because of values. My fund invests in companies that understand the worth of every human being. You've proven you don't." Richard finally broke. His voice cracked. This will ruin me." Michael's eyes softened, but only slightly. "No. Richard, you ruined yourself. All I did was reveal it." He gathered his documents, leaving behind the heavy silence of a fallen empire. Transformation. Beyond the Room 6. Months later, the fallout was complete. Hamilton Enterprises had collapsed under the weight of lawsuits, investigations, and investor withdrawals. Once celebrated as a titan of industry, Richard Hamilton's name had become synonymous with arrogance and failure. Meanwhile, Michael Johnson's story had traveled far beyond Wall Street. The recording of that infamous meeting had gone viral, accumulating millions of views online. Universities invited him to speak on business ethics and social responsibility. Global firms sought out his fund not just for money, but for the Johnson Protocols, a new set of ethical guidelines demanding inclusivity, transparency, and respect as conditions for investment. What began as one man's response to humiliation had become a movement. Young entrepreneurs, once dismissed for their backgrounds, now found doors opening where before there had only been walls. Corporations rushed to adopt diversity standards, not out of charity, but because Michael had proven that ethics and profitability could and must coexist. Michael never gloated over Richard Hamilton's fall. He had not acted out of personal vengeance but out of conviction. He believed in building a business world where no one would be judged unworthy of a handshake, no matter their race, position, or past. Standing in his new Manhattan office, surrounded by a diverse team of analysts who had once been overlooked by others, Michael looked at the skyline and whispered to himself, "The best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation." The story of Michael Johnson and Richard Hamilton is not just a tale of one man's downfall and another's rise. It is a reminder, a mirror held up to the world of business, power, and humanity. Think back to the beginning. A billionaire refused a simple handshake, believing it was beneath him. In that moment, he revealed the arrogance of an entire system. A system that thrives on belittling others, on drawing lines between worthy and unworthy. But 5 minutes later, the man he mocked revealed himself to be the very force that determined his fate. That is the lesson. Never underestimate someone based on appearance, position, or background. Because the person you dismiss today may hold the power to transform tomorrow. For too long, people like Michael have been overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected. Yet time and again, they rise. Not with anger, but with excellence. Not with revenge that destroys, but with transformation. That inspires. If this story touched your heart, ask yourself, how many Michaels exist around us right now? The young employee who isn't given a chance. The entrepreneur turned away because they don't fit the culture. The student told they'll never succeed because of where they came from. They are everywhere. And like Michael, they are quietly building, quietly preparing, waiting for the moment to prove that dignity, values, and respect matter more than arrogance, greed, or prejudice. Richard Hamilton's empire collapsed not because of numbers, but because of values. And Michael's legacy grew not because of billions, but because of principles. Now the question is for you, the one watching this story unfold. Do you believe in a world where success is measured not just in dollars, but in decency? Do you want to see more stories that reveal how injustice can be turned into justice, how arrogance can collapse, and how the underestimated can rise? Then don't just scroll away. Join this journey. Click subscribe. Share this video. Become part of the movement that believes power without ethics is weakness, and that true greatness comes from lifting others, not crushing them. Because every view, every share, every subscription spreads this message further, and who knows? Maybe your voice, combined with millions of others, will be the reason the next Michael finally gets the recognition he deserves. Remember, the greatest revolutions don't start in boardrooms or parliaments. They start with people, ordinary people, who decide they've had enough of arrogance and are ready to build a world based on respect. So, if you believe arrogance should never win, if you believe every human being deserves dignity, then don't forget, like, comment, share, subscribe, because sometimes the simple act of joining hands, even digitally, is enough to start the transformation.